Today is November 6, 2010. I'm Herschel Weisbrom, and today we're doing an oral history of the Weinman Company and Weinman family with Virginia Yates. Virginia, first of all, I'd like to get a little biographical information about you. Are you a native of Cartersville?
Yes.
And you have children, too?
I have two, a boy and a girl.
And tell me about your children.
Okay, my daughter, his name is Valerie Webb. She teaches at Cartersville High, has two children. My son lives in Philadelphia, teaches at Villanova University. He's married but has no children.
You grew up here in Cartersville?
Yes.
And how did you become associated with the Weinman family?
Well, when I was in high school, Mrs. Warren Jackson was my commercial teacher, and she came to me one day and asked me if I would be interested in doing some summer work at an office in town. And I told her, yes, of course I would. And so she sent me down for the interview with Miss Mary McCollum, that everybody called Miss Mary always. And so I was hired for the summer and stayed about 9 or 10 years.
Well, now you worked for the Weinmans considerably longer than that, though.
Well, after I left, the reason I left the office was to go up the hill to Old Mill Farm.
Oh, okay.
When Mrs. Loro's bookkeeper left. So that's when I went up the hill to the farm.
And when was this? When did you begin your association first with Mary McCollum,
well,
working for the company?
1956.
1956.
And then I worked both places for a year. And then I went to Old Mill Farm full-time after Mr. Weinman died, when Mrs. Loro became associated more with the office.
All right, we'll get into the Weinman family. First, Bill Weinman, when did he come to Bartow County?
He came in 1915 from Nicholasville, Kentucky.
And they formed a mining company.
Right. With two partners.
All right, in one of the partners was Thompson, and the other,
right.
And it was Thompson Weinman was
right.
the name of the company.
Right.
But there was another partner who did not have his name associated with the company.
That was Mr. Evans, and they also had a clay plant in McIntyre, Georgia, so they called that Evans Clay Company, but they all owned it together.
Tell me a little bit about Bill Weinman.
Well, he was 82 years old when I first met him. But of course he worked for 10 years after that, every day. He was a workaholic, but he was very much a people person. And it was just a joy to be around him. And he, just had done what he loved to do all of his life, which was work.
Thompson Weinman in the 1950s was one of the foremost businesses here.
Right.
Large number of employees. And then, what was Mr. Weinman's wife's name?
Carrie, Carrie.
And they had how many children?
They had two, and she came, her name was Carrie Weiser.
Okay.
And she came from a little place in Virginia called Weiser Valley. And then, of course, later they moved to Kentucky. And Andrew and Frances, their two children, were born in Kentucky. But when they moved to Cartersville, Andrew was 11 and Frances was 1.
I have a little personal knowledge of them, myself having been here since the 50s. I remember Mr. Weinman with the shock of real white hair, and then Andy Weinman has the football stadium here named.
Mr. Weinman built that stadium in his memory. I believe that Andrew died in about 1940, And I don't know the year that the stadium was dedicated. I was there. I think it was in 57 or 58.
I think it was 56 or 57, somewhere that it was the late 50s.
I know it was after June of 56 because that's when I got to know them.
All right. Well, Andy died tragically.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, I think he was murdered.
Yes.
Or he was killed in an altercation. And that resulted, it would be a trauma to any set of parents, but Mr. Weinman became disaffected, I understand, with the judicial system and moved out of Cartersville.
Well, I don't really know, what led up to all of that, but I know that they, of course, then lived on Cashville Road, and they, in 1950, built a house that's still there and moved to Old Mill Farm.
So, anyway, the Andy Weinman Stadium is really what it is then.
Yes.
It's called Weinman Stadium.
Mm-hmm.
But prior to that, Mr. Weinman was very philanthropic toward this community.
Yes, as a matter of fact, he was even after I went there, because it was a small office, and of course we knew everybody that came and went. And I know that he did a lot for the city then.
I've heard that he even loaned money to the city during the 30s when times were very, very hard.
I've heard that.
And now Andy Weinman, he married.
Yes.
And was, so he was a grown person
right.
at death.
See, he was born in 1904. So he married, it must have been in the late 20s because he married Virginia Myrick from Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had one daughter, and her name was Virginia. And
we will get into that a little later. Virginia Skakel, she married a Skakel.
right.
As a matter of fact, her sister-in-law was Ethel Kennedy.
Right.
And now, did Billy work at the plant or work in the business?
Young Billy?
Yes.
No, he...
I don't mean Billy. I'm sorry, Andy.
Andrew, yes, he did. And then, of course, he was the football coach
At Cartersville
the
High School. There, the connection with
right.
why the stadium was
right.
named for him. Now, what about the other child?
Frances.
Okay.
Okay, she, when she was school age, then Mr. Weinman wanted her to go to a private school, so she went to Washington Seminary in Atlanta, and she and her mother would go down on Sunday and stay through the week and then come home on the weekends, because as I was reminded when I was told this story, the roads were still dirt.
Well,
so it took a long time to get there.
That's right. Atlanta roads was, a lot of people here today do not realize that the old road to Ackworth was the main road to Atlanta
right.
in those days, and
That's
it went
right.
through Kennesaw and went through Ackworth, went through downtown Ackworth, went through downtown Kennesaw, went down to Marietta,
mm-hmm.
and on into Atlanta. So
right.
it was quite a journey.
Right.
So now, tell me about Frances.
Well, when she was in her early 20s, she married Carol Latimer,
mm-hmm.
and
they had a child, Carrie.
Yes, right. They lived in Atlanta, and they had one child, Carrie, and then at some point after that, they divorced. But by that time, Mr. and Ms. Weinman owned a home in Florida. And then, so they were there a lot during the wintertime. Never Mr. Weinman, because he was busy working. But but they were there a lot in the wintertime, and then from time to time they would they would rent an apartment in New York, and then of course by the time Frances was any age, she and her mother would always make one trek to Europe each year.
Now, later, Frances married a sportsman, which led to the horse racing connection with the Weinman.
She was married to Winifred Gardner the second time. He was, I don't know a lot about their history, but I know it's the family that owned Gardner's Island up in New York.
Okay.
And they were married about 9 years, I think. And I believe that they parted ways during the aftermath of Andrew's death, when she just felt like, Frances just felt like she needed to be with her mother and father. And so then, of course, much later, in about 1952, is when she met and married Horatio Luro.
Was there a connection to horse racing with the Weinman family before she met Horatio?
Not racing per se, but Carrie had had show horses from the time she was 8. As a matter of fact, Mr. Weinman had taken her to Kentucky to buy her first horse, and then had built a small barn on the farm for her to house that horse, and more later.
Well, there's already some history about Mr. Luro available for the Historical Society and all, so we won't pursue his end of it. So, but about how did the racing, Mr. Weinman embraced it well, having lived in Kentucky. That's the major sport up there. But and it expanded into a full-scale training facility.
Well, I believe that after they were married, and of course Mrs. Luro was more actively exposed to racing, and she learned to really like it a lot. And so then, of course, as things progressed, and of course Mr. Luro even then was very successful. He had a lot of, clients with good horses.
He had 2 Kentucky Derby winners, as a matter of fact.
Yes, but that was in the early 60s. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, in 1953 is when they decided to make it an official business. So they built another barn or 2, and started off rather small, but then they started taking boarders, and they started a training facility.
When you say boarders, you're talking about the racing circuit goes from Florida in the winter up to Saratoga and to the Maryland area, New York, Chicago, and those horses are very, very expensive, costing millions of dollars. Even in those days, very, very expensive, and they're carted usually by vans, and they stop and let them exercise here. And
well, in the early years of my being at the farm, of course, it was always, as you said, a stopover, because there were no, commercial flights. Mm-hmm. So everybody went by van, and they would come from Hialeah, which was the big track in Florida then, and stop here. And of course, the driveway as we know it now was not there at that time. Everybody came in through the plant, through Thompson Weinman plant. And sometimes you could see vans backed up all the way down to the plant coming in there.
A lot of people, we know Thompson Weinman, a lot of people don't know what they did. They primarily mined, what did they?
Well, they mined and processed calcium carbonate and varieties and mica. And the calcium carbonate came from a plant they had in Sylacauga, Alabama, where they mined and processed some of it, but then was shipped here by rail car. And then it was processed here, and some of it, a lot of it was was used in floor tile and other kinds of fillers, but some of it was processed so finely that it was used in women's makeup and that sort of thing.
I want to get from the plant a little bit more about Mr. Weinman. You said he was active in the business up until, I
Up
guess,
until the Friday before he died, on Monday.
And so he pretty well ran the business.
He definitely did.
Upon his death, who took over? Because his only son had already deceased.
Well, Mrs. Loro became a member of the board, and then as far as the office was concerned, of course, Willis Beavers was the office manager. And then, of course, a lot of the old-timers, like were running the plant. So it wasn't that it ceased to run because he had, had it so settled. But then they did had a president come in. As a matter of fact, it was one of the Evans men, Oliver Evans. And he thought that he would like that, but it didn't work out too well.
Now, I presume another Evans came later, probably in the 70s or 60s. Marshall.
Well, and his father's name was Ray, and he, of course, had visited, and Ray and Oliver both came for meetings, and then Marshall would come, but then when he went to college is when he came in the summers, and then he worked in the plant. But then after he graduated, he went to work for Mr. Buck Barnett in sales, so he was in the office.
We're going to trace the family even further down to the current heir, but we're talking about Frances now.
Mm-hmm.
And did she have any other children than Carrie?
No.
And okay, and now on Andy's side, Andy was married to Virginia.
Myrick. Mm-hmm.
Virginia Myrick, and then their daughter, Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Little Virginia, I think they called her.
I believe she was 10 when her father died. And at first, she lived with her mother and her grandmother in Atlanta. But then, after a while, she came to live with the Weinmans.
But at one time, I think she was a member of Miss Mary Lou's first kindergarten class.
Yes, she always loved Miss Mary Lou.
1933, 34, 35, somewhere in that area.
It would have been about 34 or 5.
And that would make another fascinating historical program, Miss Mary Lou and her group.
It certainly would.
And little Virginia married.
Yes, she married James Skakel, and I can't remember how long they were married, but then they divorced. But then they remarried a while later. And then after they married the second time, then they had their 5 children.
And James Skakel was from Chicago?
I don't know.
I think they were in the steel mill.
Their business, the headquarters of their business was in New York.
Oh, okay.
But now I don't know where all of the manufacturing plants were.
And but he was in the steel business.
I think that's right. And I do believe that they had a plant or some plants in West Virginia.
Well, they lived, and where did they live?
Well, they lived mostly in California. They lived there about 20 years, and then they moved to Florida, but that was in the mid-'80s.
And that was their declining years?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And Virginia's health was not that great.
And now the current heir, member of the family still associated with the farm, is Billy Wright.
Right.
And now, is he from Virginia?
No, he is Carrie. Frances,
Oh, okay.
Laura's daughter, had 3 children. Billy's the oldest. His father was Billy Wright too, William Wright. And then they divorced, and then she had 2 children by Bernard Robinson, who was owned a big farm and horses in Kentucky.
Now, where are those children now?
Well, of course, as you know, Billy's here. Carol, the middle one, the other boy, he lives in his mother's house on Bal Harbor Island in Florida. And Frances, the girl, owns her own place in Ocala, and she trains.
So they're still associated with the horse business.
Yes.
Very, very much.
Yes.
You know what became of Virginia's 5 children?
No, not currently. I did keep up with them for a long time because she and the children used to come to the farm in the summertime. But of course, after they grew older and married and this and that, I kind of lost track.
Let's talk a little bit about the Old Mill Farm. They built, the first barn was built for Carrie's
Right.
Show horses.
Right, that would have been in the 40s.
And was most of the growth after Mr. Luro married into the family?
Yes, they had, of course, that barn, and then they built another barn that we called the mare barn, which, of course, you know, is where the breeding operation is. And
Is that still in operation?
yes, on a limited basis, not as
Okay.
big as it used to be, because in its heyday, I believe the capacity at the farm was like 52 stalls, and I've seen every one of them full. So it was a really busy place back then. And then they had built a little barn up on, or a pretty good sized barn up on the hill called the weanling barn, which of course obviously means that when they took the babies away, they brought them up on the hill. And then in the 60s, it was the very early 60s, and I unfortunately didn't really ask a lot about this, but they built the huge training barn, and they always called that the Decidedly barn. So I assume it was in 1962 when Mr. Luro won the Derby.
With Decidedly. Now, he won another Derby with Northern Dancer.
In 64.
And I think Northern Dancer went on to become one of the most famous studs in history.
He was the leading sire of North America.
You say that the activities still go on there, but on a smaller scale.
Right.
Does Billy train horses?
Not anymore. He used to. As a matter of fact, he was not really at the farm a lot when he got out of college. He graduated from Vanderbilt, and then as soon as he got out of college, he went to the racetrack to help a race show, because of course by then, you know, he was getting older. And so then when Horatio retired, completely retired, I think he was about 80 then, well then Billy took over his training operation. And of course they still would be in Florida in the winter and in New York in the summer. And of course Saratoga only runs during August, so they'd be there during the month of August.
And when did Billy cease his racing activities?
I believe it was in the early 90s, and then he came to the farm to stay.
Returning briefly, and I know I'm bouncing around, I have a few notes that I have made, but not, and they're disjointed, and so will my going from place to place. We're getting back to the philanthropy. We've mentioned Weinman Stadium, but sometime later, the Weinman family left a large block of stock to the city of Cartersville for the purpose of eventually building a museum.
Well, Mrs. Laura was personally involved in that, and she and the 2 girls, Carrie and Jenny Skakel, we called her, they they pooled their resources and had that built. Actually is when all that happened, and it was built, was paid for with stock, and then as soon as it was built, of course, she had, signed it over to the city.
Okay, and the Weinman Mineral Museum was here for a number of years, and now
Right.
it has been swallowed up and become a part of TELUS.
Right.
Because there's a Weinman Gallery
Yes.
there, which is probably as large as the museum was.
Right.
Greatly enhanced also. So Weinman Stadium and Weinman Mineral Museum are the two major legacies of the Weinman family, but they did many other smaller
Sure.
contributions to this community.
Mr. Weinman, who preferred to remain anonymous. Not many people ever knew that. Even after Mrs. Lauro died, someone in the city called me one day to ask about an account that they had that Mr. Weinman had actually started, and there was still money in it, and they wanted to know what to do with it. And I said, well, I know that particular account, why he started it, it was to buy shoes for children in the city. And I didn't know, whatever. I guess that with the changing of the political climate, maybe it just kind of got lost. But anyway, I told him that, I didn't really know, but it should be used for something that he would appreciate.
One other area I wanted to discuss, and we've mentioned it briefly. Mr. Weinman at one time lived on Cassville Road.
Yes.
And that house, I believe, was built by, I don't know the first name of the person, Harris Cope was his son, and he was a former football coach and quite famous one. Mm-hmm. Mr. Cope built that house. Then it became Mr. Weinman's house.
Right.
And when Mr. Weinman moved to the mill, then Ray Dellinger moved into it.
Right.
With the associations, it would seem both were in the mining industry. Was there any official association between the Dellingers and the Weinmans?
Not business-wise, but they were always extremely close. And, of course, that has resulted in my getting to know Jimmy myself, because he was a pretty regular visitor to the farm. So, going back to the Weinmans living on Cassville Road, I don't know if it would be of interest, but I remember Mrs. Weinman telling me that when they first moved here, that they lived in the Braben Hotel. And then I guess Mr. Weinman was finding them someplace to live, and then they lived on West Main Street in a White House, and then after that's when they moved to Cassville Road.
And then when did he build the house on the farm?
1950.
So was that when he moved from Cassville Road, and the Dellingers took over that home?
He first built it and with the idea of having some place to entertain his clients, because they first called it the clubhouse. But then he began to see how inconvenient it was for him not to be around, so then I think they just moved in.
Does Billy Wright live there now?
Yes.
Was Virginia's husband, Mr. Skakel, did he ever come to Cartersville, or was he take an interest in this? Because I do know that he raced ponies.
Well, and he was, as Jenny used to say, he was always at the big races wherever they were, whether it was in Europe or here. And but he never really came to Old Mill Farm. I think the part he really enjoyed was when the horses got to the racetrack. So Jenny and the children would come.
And they stayed there. You got associated, you were married, you said, by Mary McCollum. I mean, were hired by Mary McCollum.
Yes.
According to my memory, Miss Mary worked there a long, long, long time.
Miss Mary was Mr. Weinman's first female employee.
And so that would go back to the 20s or so,
Yes.
or below, before.
Yes.
And how long did she work there?
She worked, she was there when I left in 1966, and she worked a little bit after that, but I don't remember how
But
many
into
years.
the late 60s.
Yes, she was
So
there.
she was there close to a half century, or at least a half century,
Right,
you could say.
and she used to tell me about when she first came to work, how they paid in cash, and what a challenge that was.
And was there a purpose for that?
I don't know. It must have had something to do with the climate of the banking industry then. I don't know. Maybe nobody, had the facilities to get a
There
check.
was very little regulation in those days.
And maybe the employees didn't, have the opportunity to go get a check cashed. I don't know what all of that was about.
I can remember in my early days that everybody didn't have a checking account.
Right.
And stores didn't kindly take checks unless
Right.
they knew who you were.
Right. And so I suspect, that it was all about the convenience to the employees.
Well, Virginia, it has been a pleasure being with you. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure people who view this in future years will learn a great deal about the Weinman family. And thank you so much for your time.
Well, you're welcome. And I guess that I should add that the influence of Mr. and Mrs. Weinman definitely lasted through the life of Frances, because she was just as much of I called her a people helper, because she always was there when somebody was in need.
As I recall, they were members of the local Episcopal Church.
She was. Mm-hmm.
And she and
Mr. Leroux was Catholic. But Frances and her father belonged to the Episcopal Church, and Mrs. Weinman belonged to the Methodist Church.
Well, but most of the Weinman family, they are buried here, are they not?
Yeah, they all are. Mm-hmm.
They are all buried here. So, and they are a major part of Bartow County and Cartersville's history.
Yes.
And we appreciate you sharing this
Well,
with
you
us.
are more than welcome. Of course, it's, right after my own heart.
I'm Herschel Weisbrom, and that is our interview with Virginia Yates.